I'm going to be speaking kind of multifaceted lens, but it's going to start kind of with a specific presidential case study and then expand outwards into history touching upon Prince William County, colonial America more broadly, and my own specific family history. I will mention at the outset there is some outdated racialized terminology that will be present in this discussion as it speaks to specific 18th century terminology, and it will be talked about in both a legal setting of what the terminology was referring to and also in a generational, genetic, genealogical aspect as well. So first, let's start with this image that everyone here is probably pretty familiar with, right? If we're talking about famous images from the Revolutionary War, there's the crossing of the Delaware, which chronologically was like the day before this. And then there's this one, right? And Washington looks all gallant and steadfast up there. And there's the injured dude right here. But what often gets overlooked is there's an injured dude down there who looks like he's really feeling the ouch of it all. And this was John Trumbull's famous painting, The Capture of the Hessians at Trenton, December 26th, 1776, so literally a day after the crossing. And that wounded dude displaying the deep ouch is First Lieutenant James Monroe, 3rd Virginia Regiment. There's as close as we can get, looking pained and in anguish, right? And from a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography that features the more famous image, Washington's Crossing, the author David Hackett Fisher notes that of this painting, the Trumbull one, the severely wounded figure lying behind Rawls' extended hand is Lieutenant James Monroe. Holding him is Dr. John Riker, who saved his life on the battlefield. And then from the autobiography of James Monroe, I should mention James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States. This was just an unfamiliar factoid. But long before he became the 5th president of the United States, he was an 18-year-old at the Battle of Trenton. And from Monroe's own biography, which he wrote about himself in the 3rd person. So strong editorial choices. Like Queen Victoria did not have a stranglehold in terms of the royal we. Captain Washington then moved forward with the vanguard. That is actually George's cousin, Captain William Washington, not referring to George himself. Things go wrong. He received a severe wound and was taken from the field. The command then devolved upon Lieutenant Monroe, speaking of himself, who attacked in like manner at the head of the corps and was shot down by a musket ball which passed through his breast and shoulder. He was also carried from the field. That makes it sound very passive. As an English professor, I would emphasize action verbs rather than was carried. But it makes it sound like it was just a very passive process. So that's how he recounts it. One quote here, this Daughters of the American Revolution magazine from a little over a century ago, December 1923. And James Monroe, soldier, written by Rose Governor Hose. Those Dutch American names sometimes. So I'm going with that. But in her profile on Monroe, the British soldiers entered Trenton pell-mell in such haste that it might be likened to the rush, fright, and confusion, which will likely occur when the last trumpet sounds. You've gotta love how they spoke and communicated. When Captain Washington and Lieutenant Monroe rushed upon the gunners and captured pieces, Both officers were wounded in the exploit, the captain in both hands, and Monroe was hit in the shoulder by a ball which cut an artery. And in terms of things not to have happened to you on a battlefield in 1776, a cut artery is pretty much near the top if we're hoping for long-term survival likelihood. The ball remained in his left shoulder as long as he lived. It is probably in his coffin today. The gallant action on the part of his two officers helped materially to demoralize the enemy and materially hasten the victory of the Americans at the Battle of Trenton. For bravery under fire, Monroe was promoted by General Washington on the battlefield to the rank of captain. A letter written by Monroe 6 months before his death in New York and owned by one of his descendants, dated January 9th, 1831, gives a modest description of his part in this great revolutionary battle. It reads, and then there's too much text there, but I will turn in on the more relevant part. Soon afterwards, I was shot through the shoulder by a ball which grazed the breast. I was carried by 2 or 3 soldiers, for I fell, to the room where Captain Washington was under the care of 2 surgeons, by whom my wound was likewise dressed. So, a wounded Lieutenant Monroe is depicted in Trumbull's rather iconic painting of the aftermath of the Battle of Trenton. And both in Monroe's own recountances, albeit rather passively, but here a bit more descriptively in a letter held by one of his descendants, and then featured in the DAR magazine a century afterwards, more than a century ago though, about the 2 or 3 soldiers who carried him, who helped him off the field of battle, who helped in part to ensure his survival, which is the reason why we eventually get him as the 5th president and not that one dude we don't remember. And what's quite interesting, again, these people speaking kind of in the third person of a letter owned by one of his descendants. Well, that was the woman who wrote the article, actually. Because Rose Governor Ho's obituary from the Evening Sun of Baltimore, Maryland, dated May 27, 1933. Mrs. Rose G. Host dies in Washington, great-granddaughter of President Monroe, to be buried in Frederick, Maryland. So when she's referencing a letter that then ex-President Monroe wrote, in which he recounted, that was in her personal correspondences, that was inherited by her or a near family member that she had access to, and was then thankfully featured to the public writ large in the DAR magazine. So we have correspondence and the evidence from Monroe himself and in the Monroe lineage about the 2 or 3 men who helped carry him, then shot a severed artery from the field of battle. Who were those 2? Well, when we turn to the Revolutionary War pension claims, because there's a lot of interesting evidence in the Revolutionary War pension claims, most of which date from the 18-teens, 20s, and even into the 30s. So a full half century, give or take, after the battle, and after the Revolutionary battles themselves. State and District of Virginia, Frederick County, pension application of James Hamilton on this day, 15th day of May, 1818, personally appeared James Hamilton, age 59 years. That he, the said James Hamilton, enlisted in the county of Berkeley in the state of Virginia in the 4th Virginia Regiment on Continental Establishments in the fall of the year 1776. And then in addendum notes, so much later on, after he's gone. But on May 16, 1850, a letter was sent to the pension office on behalf of Rebecca Hamilton, asking for an increase in her pension on the grounds that, quote, Her husband was an officer at the Battle of Trenton, where he bore Colonel Monroe, then lieutenant, he hadn't been promoted yet, later Major and 5th President of the U.S., from the field of battle, and received from him 750 acres of land for his gallantry. And there is a transcription of the original script in which it's mentioned. Highlighted section there. You can see gallantry because it looks all cool and old-timey cursive. And when we look at the Revolutionary pension records, James Hamilton, 4th Regiment, rank of sergeant, enlisted. I'm gonna skip over some of the specifics here, but where did his regiment serve? Battle of Trenton, right service, right regiment, right place, right time. I guess there's a blue one highlighted there. Wheaton's 3rd Virginia Regiment, Colonel George Wheaton. Who was the other person? So pension application of John Sidebottom, or Sidebottom. I'll be honest, it sucks when a name can have like 25 different spelling variations. And this is a name that, until it got standardized, had 25 different spelling variations. So my research had to account for O's and A's and Y's and E's. It's just basically Wheel of Fortune every day when doing research on this family name. But the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Clark County, on this 8th day of May 1819, before me the describer, one of the circuit judges from the state of Kentucky, personally appeared John Sidebottom, alias Sidebottom, aged about 69 years. Skipping further down the highlighted portion, when he joined the regiment of Colonel Wheaton, and afterwards by Colonel Thomas Marshall. And then later records, this one from December 1821, John Sidebottom appeared before me and made oath that he enlisted as a sergeant in the year 1776 for 3 years in Captain Charles West Company of the 3rd Virginia Regiment on Continental Line commanded by Colonel Marshall. He is now 71 years old, has 17 living children. The youngest is only 8 months old. So sometimes you just gotta tip your hat at the virility and all. But he is very poor and scarcely able to maintain them, which makes a whole lot of sense. Below that, Charles Lander appeared before me, a justice of the peace for some county, and made oath that he was in the same company and regiment with John Sidebottom, Captain West Company, 3rd Virginia Regiment, on the Continental Line, commissioned by Colonel Wheaton and Colonel Marshall. So it was established, and he did receive a pension that Sidebottom did serve, John Sidebottom did serve, and did receive a pension for his revolutionary service. And then 3rd Virginia Regiment, Battle of Trenton, under its command, Wheaton and Marshall. The regiment saw action in the New York campaign, the battles of Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth, and the siege of Charleston. So there are exactly two people who ever show up in the historical record as claiming credit for helping to save the life of President James Monroe. And it is Hamilton, not Alexander, the other one I just mentioned, and John Sidebottom. And you'd think maybe other people would have tried to claim dibs, right? Or be like, it's not as... a tall tale could have cropped up, but it never did and it never does. These are the only two in the historical record. So evidence works on several angles. There's factuals, there's counterfactuals. There's no silver bullet I'll get to in a second, but these are the two men who claimed the credit and were at the battle and at the right place. And here we get the mention on May 27th, 1844, Sam Hansen stated that he'd heard John Sidebottom say, quote, that he was one of the two men who bore from the field to the battle during the Revolutionary War the late President of the United States, James Monroe, after he was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, December 26, 1776. And then some records related to that show Sidebottom's actual service in the 3rd Virginia Regiment. Page 23 there is where it mentions the part of him having carried James Monroe off. Now, we get a later correspondence of evidence from John Sidebottom's lineage that says some interesting things about this. The department from Gladstone, Missouri, February 17th, 1907, to the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Pensions, Washington, D.C. I'm trying to establish a truth in connection with my paternal grandfather, John Sidebottom, of the Virginia Regiment. That James Monroe was wounded in the Battle of Brandywine, quite Trenton. And this man saved his life by carrying him on his back during the retreat. I know it to be true, but can find no history in the book where I will. The Newberry Library of Chicago referred me to Bureau of Pensions for his military record. It was grandfather's impression that Monroe made a record of it. He wrote a letter and thanked him while he was president and said he would have a record made of it. But if he did, we are unable to find it. I would give much to have it established as a truth. And know that I carry on tradition. On there, dated or signed Mrs. E.C. Shelton, Gladstone, Missouri. And then same person writing, what was this one dated? 1907, so nearly a decade earlier from June 1889. Also, an honorable mention was made of the heroic service of John Sidebottom during a battle in which he carried James Monroe in his arms during a retreat. This is on file in the archives. Can I obtain a copy of it? Miss Wilda Sidebottom, Gladstone, Missouri. And this Miss Wilda Sidebottom, here is her DAR lineage record. Descendant, daughter of Peter Sidebottom, granddaughter of John Sidebottom and Jane McCarty. John, 1750 to 1823, was placed on the pension roll of Clark County, Kentucky, 1819, for service as a private Virginia line. It's quite interesting looking at the family tree here too, because Peter was, I think, at 8-month-old, or very nearly, in terms of one of his very late in life childs, having been sired when John was 67-ish. And then also Wilda Sidebottom was born when Peter himself was nearly 60. So even though she's writing these letters and asking for further clarification quite a long time after the historical circumstance, she's not far removed genealogically speaking. She's the granddaughter, right, of the soldier served. So from her father, who would have had limited memory of his own father, but would have heard stories from the elder siblings, Wilda gets the stories, and the oral history passed down to her as well. So this is kind of where we're at with it. We know James Monroe gets shot. We know he is likely to have died along with many others who did die at the Battle of Trenton, if not for like the heroic interception of two peers, two brethren soldiers who helped carry him off the field of battle and to safety, and then into the care of Dr. Riker, who will perform surgery on him and help ensure that he survives. But that letter has never been found. There is no letter there is no extant letter, if there ever was one, in which President James Monroe was like, and to my most sincere, like, I owe you, buddy, John Sidebottom / Sidebottom, whichever spelling you prefer. Thank you for saving my life a half century. Here's a cookie. That's not there, but we are told in both his own language and the records of his family and letters held by his descendants that it was two men carried him off, and the two men do name themselves in the historical record, and no one else ever makes a claim to it. So the contextual and historical alignment is as best we can get that John Sidebottom and Charles Hamilton were the two who actually did this heroic action, risking their own safety to save this kid, this 18-year-old kid, from a mortal wound. Now, things take an interesting turn when we look more at John Sidebottom himself. So there's a DAR published volume that is some 800 pages called Forgotten Patriots, African American and American Indian Patriots in the Revolutionary War. In notes, George Harrison Sanford King, who's a noted genealogist and did a lot of research in the Nova region. In a letter to Dear Martha, dated November 23rd, 1982, from his collection held by the Virginia Historical Society. And I have a long account, and most interesting, of one Sidebottom of this area helping to carry wounded James Monroe, then Colonel, Lieutenant, from the field of battle. Uncle J.M. never forgot Sidebottom, a mulatto. I have much of the story. And this is interesting too, because he says Uncle J.M. Sanford King was not a nephew, but he was a descendant of a first cousin of James Monroe. So he was heavily acquainted and an adept researcher of President James Monroe and the larger Monroe lineage. And then when we look here under the S's, and you see some of the spelling variants I was in fact talking about. Sidebottom, 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 Joseph, mixed descent, quote mulatto, from Prince William County. Sidebottom, 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 John, African American, mulatto, Stafford County. And from the pension application of Charles Lander of Bourbon County, Kentucky, it's 14th day of August, 1832. appeared Charles Lander, a resident of Bergen County in the state of Kentucky, aged 77 years, the 29th December last past. And swears, "Here I acted as a sergeant, had a corporal and 16 privates under my command, amongst whom were the following persons now recollected," various others, and then 2 colored men, to wit, John and Joseph Sidebottom, and their pension application numbers are listed. Signed Charles Lander, state of Kentucky, Clark County. And then there you can see the original 2 colored men, to wit, John and Joseph Sidebottom. So this is the one singular piece of historical evidence that labels John and Joseph Sidebottom of Prince William County as being mixed race African American men. And then there's the pension application of John's brother, Joseph, settled in Henry County, outside of Louisville, Kentucky. And he shows up in the historical records of the Revolutionary War as well, and his pension application was also approved for service. Interesting record in which, after the death of John and the widows of each man, were seeking continued pension assistance and support. Sorry, this is a little small, but the evidence of Miss Catherine Davis the evidence of Mrs. Catherine Davis taken before me, the subscriber, justice of the peace, in and for the county of Prince William and state of Virginia, this 27th day of August, 1841, as follows. Question: did you know anything of Joseph and John Sidebottom respecting the Revolutionary? Answer: as to Joseph Sidebottom, he enlisted and went to the war. Whether he served during the war or not, I do not know. As to John Sidebottom, he enlisted and went to the war and did not return until the war was over, and I heard him say he served during the war in the Continental Line. Question: what do you know respecting the heirs of John and Joseph Sidebottom? Answer: I know Nancy Sidebottom, a very old woman. She is the sister to both John and Joseph Sidebottom, and is the only living heir to either of them that I know anything of that is living at this time. Given under my hand this 27th of August, 1841, Catherine Davis. So this was the evidence gathered from Prince William County as to who was aware, who could recount of these 2 men, of the 2 brothers. And the sibling who is still alive shows up here in 1840. This is Anne, variously Nancy. At that point in time, those names were the same. So you would find a woman labeled as variously Anne or Nancy in the record, but were in reference to the same individual person. Anne Sidebottom, listed as free white person, female, 70 to 79, and she is the last of the Sidebottoms who shows up chronologically in the timeline, as she's in the 1840 census. She shows up in a few records here in the 1840s, but is deceased by the 1850 census. She does not show up in the 1830 or 1820 census. I promise you I've searched every spelling of Sidebottom that I possibly could. Just not there. Don't know if she went and walked about on those 2 days in question, once each decade. But in 1810, we find her, and she is not white in 1810. She is, on August 6th, 1810, number of all other free persons. This was the categorization for the free people of color at the time. So in 1840, as an elderly woman, she is white. 30 years before, she was not. She was established as a free woman of color. And then there, if you see that one tick mark over in the column by itself, that is her. That is for where the free people of color were designated. And everyone else is census accounted as white. And yet, in Kentucky, where the Sidebottoms had moved to, in 1810, while Nancy is African American in Prince William County and is listed as a free person of color, John Sidebottom, head of a white household, Joseph Sidebottom, head of a free white household. There are other Sidebottoms. There's Peter Sidebottom, head of a free white household. And in fact, there were 4 of them who came to Kentucky. Charles in Greene County, originally in 1800, all these 4 who are all brothers, along with their sister Nancy. So these 4 of the Sidebottom siblings traveled westward and went to the then frontier of Kentucky. Charles, John, Joseph, and Peter. In every record in which they show up in Kentucky, they are never listed as anything other than white, except for that one Revolutionary War pension file recountance of Charles Lander, who served with John and Joseph. So this tells me that what did the brothers do? They passed. And Nancy, having stayed behind and having continued to live in Prince William County, the family was known to be a free family of color. They were known to be African American. And maybe just, I don't know, if old age alone bestowed whiteness to her between 1810 and 1840. Or maybe anyone who had been intimately acquainted with her genetic inheritance was dead of old age, and she got the benefit of deuces, people, and got to reinvent herself as a senior citizen. I do not know the circumstances, but the brothers who went to the frontier did consciously reinvent themselves and their racial heritage. Now, when we look back at Prince William County here, there are Sidebottoms earlier on who still show up in the historical record. A Thomas and a William, variously listed in the tax records in the 1780s and 1790s. And then a great resource I recommend, the Prince William Reliquary. Mary Sidebottom was allowed £3 for her support, her sons being in the Continental Service in November 1778. These are 2 soldiers in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, so that could be her sons, are her sons. So this is one of only 2 mentions we get of the parentage at this late of a date post, or well, actually during the Revolutionary War itself, but of their mother, their father already being deceased by this point. And then from the Virginia State Library, Author's Account Book, 1779, 1780, transcription of a reference from page 21. Warrant for Mary Sidebottom of Prince William County, mother of a soldier for her support, August 9th, 1779. And that is the last instance in which either parent of the siblings shows up in the historical record. Their father was already deceased. We'll look at why in just a moment. But this is the last time that their mother appears. So their mother was alive in Prince William County as of August 1779, and was then not known of thereafter. The Sidebottoms do not originally come from Prince William County. They come from the parent county next door, and that's going to be Stafford County. Albeit St. Paul's Church just happens to now be in King George County. But at the time, everything was Stafford. So in the Register of St. Paul's Parish, 1715 to 1798, written by, there's that name again, George Harrison Sanford King, he went and transcribed all the old birth, marriage, death records. There we find Sidebottom listed. Thomas, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom. That's one of my favorite, variant forms of the name that I have found. Born January 7th, 1736/7. Gotta mention a little something about that year listing. We were still on the old calendar. We had not aligned with Europe yet. So the calendar we were still using had March 25th as the start of the new year. But that's why the 7 shows up, because by present day accounting for, we would label that as born January 7th, 1737, right? And there's a blank, so an illegible name. William, son of Peter and Sarah. Charles, son of Peter and Sarah, March 1746 by present recounting. Peter, a free mulatto, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, April 9th, 1748. And then a decade after that, Anne, daughter of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, August 18th, 1758. And then 2 final listings, Sarah, daughter of William and Elizabeth, 1767, and Thomas, son of William and Elizabeth Sidebottom, 1769. The gap there is going to be presumed. The Sarah and Thomas are actually the children of this William, the one born in 1743, because it's a quarter century later when we get these birth dates for the final 2 listed. But here we get our third and last in the historical record of the Sidebottoms being counted as a miscarriage-free family color. In that, in the birth record of one of the Sidebottoms, and only one is labeled as such, but same parentage is listed for all, so we gotta follow Occam's razor here and just assume. If one sibling is labeled as a free mulatto, all the siblings are by extension free individuals of color as well. What's real interesting here is 1748, Anne Nancy, who shows up in 1810 and 1840, that's her. John and Joseph are not in the registry. So the 2 who served in the Revolution and the 2 who joined Charles and Peter, their other brothers, in Kentucky on the frontiers, they're not here. And I've thought and wondered a lot of why are John and Joseph not here? And I literally made me wonder if it was because the parents, Peter and Sarah, were several children, just name recorded, right? No indication of racialized status. But Peter, the scribe, made sure to note not white. And I wonder if for the 2 successive births following, John and Joseph, if they were just afraid of that status being affixed to them and why their births are not recorded in the register. maybe there was someone in the parish who had an axe to grind, was more racist than the general level of racist. I do not know. But for whatever reason, a decade later, the final Sidebottom sibling, her birth is recorded, and the only daughter, Anne. To belabor complicated language, this gets quite interesting. There was a legal definition attached to this term. We think of it as just being maybe a racist term thrown around, and that doesn't mean it wasn't. But it also had a legal status in the era in which the Sidebottom siblings were born. And a law passed, Virginia passed a law in October 1705, defining, to legally codify mixed race status and inheritance. That the child of an Indian and the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro shall be deemed, accounted, held, and taken to be a mulatto. So with Peter and Nancy and John and Joseph being described as mulatto, it means they are either the child, grandchild, or the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of an African American. And I've accounted both through historical record and genetic evidence why their generational pinning has to be at the grandchildren level. First off, if we think about it, the four brothers who came to the frontiers of Kentucky and racially passed, if one of their parents had been an unadmixed African American, they would not have been able to racially pass as being fully biracial, half black, half white. The standards of the day and of the 18th century would not have allowed the slippage of one racialized category so completely into the other. There had to be the mutability, which means phenotypic lightness of skin. So, and I also, there's genetic evidence that counters why it would be at the great-grandchildren level. The inheritance of DNA amongst descendants would not work if it was that generational distance. So the only generational level that's really going to work for everything to harmonize between the historical record, being able to racially pass on the frontier, and also for the level of sub-Saharan African DNA inherited by various Sidebottom descendants, is going to be if John, Joseph, Nancy, Peter, Charles, and William were all the grandchildren, of an African American individual. Well, when I look elsewhere in the historical record, from Ryan's Virginia Gazette from Williamsburg, April 1773, we find Peter Sidebottom from Stafford for horse stealing, guilty. And note that the father of the mixed race Sidebottom children was named Peter Sidebottom. And then from 2 weeks later, on Thursday, May 6, 1773, this day the following criminals received a sentence at the Capitol. Peter Sidebottom for horse stealing, death. So Peter Sidebottom Sr., the father and patriarch of the family, was executed in May 1773 for horse stealing. That's harsh. This is, interestingly, indicative of a pattern for the life of Peter Sidebottom, the father. In the volume by Peter Wilson College, More Emigrants in Bondage, 1614 to 1775, which recounts indentured servitude records. Peter Sidebottom of Salford, which is in the Lancashire. SQS stands for Sentence at the Quarter Sessions. January 1724, transported April 1725, and the LA is not Louisiana, as we might think of it, but Lancashire. So a Peter Sidebottom of Salford, Lancashire, committed some crime unknown, but his punishment was get out of here. You were not allowed to stay in England. You were going away. And I had stumbled at first on January 1724 to April 1725. 15 months is just a long time between punishment and being sent off, as it were. I was like, what is this, the contemporary judicial system? And instead, I was like, oh, duh, Caleb, it's the calendar. 1725 started on March 25th. So it's rather a 3-month gap, not a 15-month. There's a Peter Sidebottom who shows up in baptism record July 21st, 1703, in the parish records of Manchester, of which Lancashire was a part, with a father's name, Thomas Sidebottom. Note here, in the family of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, in the St. Paul's Parish Register of what was then Stafford County, the firstborn named child is Thomas. And what do we know about the historical naming patterns? What would the father name his firstborn son? His father's name, right? So Thomas to Peter, and then Peter to Thomas. And then, in fact, that Thomas is deceased early because he never shows up again in the historical record. But William, the eldest surviving son, who is one of only 2 of the siblings to stay in Virginia and not move to the Kentucky frontier and racially pass, names his firstborn son Thomas. So there's that familial indication of the names repeating as well. Before closing, we pull in a little DNA evidence, because I'm a genealogist as well, and that undergirds a lot of my research with the historical records. There's me on 23andMe, where I tested every platform, but got lucky and had a distant cousin test, and I'll label him Max, just to keep his first name anonymity. But what's important is his last name is Sidebottom. And I'm sharing DNA in common with him. And he's from my line, which is the Peter Sidebottom line. And here is Max's family tree that stretches back to the Peter Sidebottom, labeled in the St. Paul's Parish Registry as a, quote, a free mulatto. And there you can see me with my 0.3% sub-Saharan African ancestry. So I'm pretty far down the tree, so my inheritance, as you can see, is not a lot from the specific ancestry in question. But haplogroups. Some of you who are genealogists might be familiar with these terms. There's 3 types of DNA. Autosomal, the recombination we get from parents regardless of inheritance path. The Y DNA and MT, mitochondrial DNA, are very specific and have hard and fast rules of you inherit your Y DNA from your father's 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 father ad infinitum, and you inherit your mother's 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 haplogroup ad infinitum back. Max Sidebottom has a paternal haplogroup of I-PF4135. It's all Greek to me. But what that actually means is on the human Y DNA tree, we can slot where that original man with that mutation patrilineally back across the millennia, and these things actually evolve over millennia. This branch on the human Y DNA family tree arose about 3,100 years ago in Eurasia. And if the Sidebottom male lineage itself was going to have been the African American source of the family inheritance, we would be looking for a different Y DNA signature. We would be looking for a Y DNA signature that would be placed within sub-Saharan Africa. But instead, in the historical record, we find Peter Sidebottom, born in 1703, sentenced and transported in 1725, executed in 1773, and with a European Y DNA male signature. So the male Sidebottom lineage is European. The African American ancestry comes through the mother, through Sarah. And it's quite interesting because middle names were not really a feature of, like, Betty Sue was not a naming habit at the time period, but she's Sarah in the St. Paul's Parish Register. She's Mary in Prince William County when she shows up as the mother and is listed as receiving funds for the service of her sons. So I've been real clever and have just labeled her Sarah Mary, last name unknown. But what's quite interesting is, like, because of this, as a genealogist, sometimes you get lucky. As a researcher, sometimes you get lucky. A birth ordering of the children is going to correspond with giving a, like, tightened window into which the time frame she would have had to have been born. So the earliest listed child is this Thomas, born January 7th, 1737. The latest, the last child born is Anne, born August 1758. Again, here's where Occam's razor comes in a little bit. I'm assuming she was no younger than 16 at the birth of her first son. It's a reasonable standard I hope to be true. I hope she was no younger than 16 on the date of birth of Thomas. With Anne/Nancy, I'm going to assume she was no older than 45 at the birth of her last child. I've reverse engineered this timeline, and with a youngest birth date presumed of 16 here and an oldest presumed birth date of 45 for there, it means that Sarah Mary was born between 1713 and 1721. And that's great evidence that isn't otherwise found in the historical record itself, but can be deduced from the birth listing of the children. So this means with the labeling of the mixed-race Sidebottom family and with John, the mulatto who helped save the life of an 18-year-old at the Battle of Trenton, who went on to become the 5th president of the United States. That they were a family of their era. They were a free, mixed-race family with a father who was executed for horse stealing and sentenced to the colonies as an indentured servant. And he fell in love with and had a family with a biracial woman who was herself going to have been of half European, half African American ancestry. And the family that remained here in Prince William County remained African American in the historical record for a time until they weren't. Until eventually by 1840, even that racialized status falls away from them. But the siblings who left decades early, all of whom, the Charles, Peter, John, and Joseph, who went to Kentucky, to the frontier, reinvented themselves as white men and were able to live the lives of, I'm not going to call having 17 kids a life of ease, but were able to live the kind of lives that they sought for themselves, away from the prejudices and the judgments of where their status would have hindered forward advancement. And that's all I got.